The sergeant did not ask if they were ready. He never asked that. Readiness, in his view, was not a feeling a soldier reported. It was a condition a soldier achieved or failed to achieve, and either way the parade ground did not care about the difference. He stood before 8 young men in the gray December cold of Chelsea barracks, hands clasped behind his back, and he looked at them the way a carpenter looks at timber he is about to trust with something structural. "You have been selected," he said, "for the bearer party of the state funeral of Sir Winston Spencer Churchill." Nobody moved. "You will carry the coffin from St. Paul's Cathedral to the gun carriage. You will carry it again from the gun carriage into the cathedral. You will carry it out. You will carry it to Tower Pier. At no point, gentlemen, will you falter." Gareth Rees was 19 years old. He was from Merthyr Tydfil. He had been in the Welsh Guards for 14 months, and he had spent most of that time learning to stand perfectly still, which he had assumed was the hardest thing the army would ask of him. He was wrong. The sergeant let the silence sit for a moment, the way experienced men let silence sit, not because they have run out of words, but because they understand that some words need room to land properly. "The coffin," he said, "weighs 500 pounds. Gareth wrote home that night, not about the selection. His mother would worry, and there was nothing useful worry could do in Merthyr Tydfil that week. He wrote about the weather instead, and about the food, and about a corporeal named Davies who had developed an inexplicable hatred for a particular pigeon that visited the barracks every morning at 7. He did not write, "I have been given a thing I am not sure I can do." He thought it, though. He thought it lying on his bunk in the dark, listening to the other men breathe, working out the arithmetic of it without meaning to. 500 pounds divided across 8 men. 62 pounds per man, more or less. He could lift 62 pounds. He had lifted 62 pounds many times. That was not the problem, and some part of him already understood that the problem was not going to be the kind that arithmetic solved. The problem was that you did not get to put it down. Whatever happened, whatever your shoulders said, whatever your knees decided, whatever your body did in the way that bodies sometimes do without asking permission, you did not get to put it down. Not in front of the cathedral steps, not on the Strand with half of London watching, not anywhere between the lying-in state and Tower Pier, with the whole of the watching world holding its breath. You carried it or you didn't. And if you didn't, there was no version of your life after that moment that you could look at cleanly. The rehearsals began the following morning. They used to practice coffin first, same dimensions, weighted with sandbags to approximate the load. The sergeant watched from 10 feet away and said nothing for the first 20 minutes, which the men would later understand was kindness. He was letting them discover the problem themselves, because some things cannot be told. They can only be found. What they found was this: carrying a coffin is not like carrying a stretcher, or a beam, or any of the other things a young soldier might have carried. A stretcher has handles. A beam sits across your shoulder and you lean into it. A coffin sits on your shoulder and you stand under it, and the load transfers down through your spine in a way that your body has no memory of, no stored instruction for, no muscle that has been waiting to do this specific work. Your body tries to reclassify it, tries to find the nearest thing it knows, fails. By the second day, the bruising had started. Not the ordinary kind, not the yellow-green bruise of a knock or a tumble. This was deeper, a purple-black stripe across the top of each shoulder where the coffin edge sat, pressing with a slow, patient, absolute authority that no amount of padding entirely solved. The men compared them in the barracks at night with a strange, wordless camaraderie, the way soldiers compare scars from things they survived together. Private Thomas Griffiths, 20 years old, from Swansea, the tallest man on the team, which meant the load sat differently on him than on the others, went down on the 3rd day. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would have filmed or remembered as a moment. His knees simply stopped cooperating on the 32nd step of the practice run, folding inward with a kind of apologetic surrender, and the left side of the practice coffin dropped 2 inches before the men beside him compensated. The sergeant said nothing. Griffiths got up. They ran the sequence again. This was, Gareth would understand much later, the most important thing the sergeant ever taught them, not through instruction, not through speech, but through silence, through the simple act of not making it a disaster. Griffiths went down. Griffiths got up. They continued. The sky did not fall. The decision to continue was available to them always as long as they chose it. They ran the sequence 11 more times that day. Nobody told them what the world was preparing. They knew, in the abstract way that any British soldier in January 1965 knew, that Churchill's death was not an ordinary death. He had died on January 24th, a Sunday morning, and the news had come through the radio in the same flat, careful BBC voice that delivered all news floods in Somerset, a trade dispute, the death of the man who had told a nation it had nothing to offer but blood and toil and tears and sweat, and meant it as a promise. The voice did not change. The weight of the thing changed everything around it. 112 nations would send representatives to the funeral. 350 million people would watch it on television, the largest television audience in history to that point, a number so large that the men of the bearer party, had they known it, would probably have found it less frightening than more, because numbers that size stop feeling real. The lying-in state had drawn 300,000 people in 4 days. The queues stretched for miles. People stood in it for 6, 7, 8 hours in the January cold. Ordinary people, people who had queued in a different kind of cold 20 years before and remembered what it had cost and what it had been worth. They were not coming to see a coffin. They were coming to say something that English people on the whole are not well equipped to say out loud. They were coming to say, "You mattered and we knew it, and we will not forget." The bearer party practiced their steps and did not know the size of what they were stepping into. Gareth thought about his grandfather. His grandfather had been at Dunkirk, had come back from Dunkirk in the particular way that men came back from Dunkirk, alive, and quiet about it, and quietly shaped by it for the rest of his life in ways that only showed at odd angles in odd lights. He never talked about Churchill directly. He talked around him the way you talk around something very bright, describing the edges, the effect, the shadow it cast, but not looking at it straight. Once when Gareth was 12, his grandfather had said, "That man told us the truth and we were grateful for it." Gareth had not understood that then. The truth in his 12-year-old experience was generally something adults softened before delivering. The idea that truth could be a gift, that a man standing at a microphone saying we may fail, we may fall, it will be hard and long and terrible could be received as something to be grateful for, that had taken years to make sense. Standing on the Chelsea barracks parade ground in the gray January cold with a bruise the shape of a coffin edge across his shoulder, he thought he was beginning to understand it. January 30th, 1965. Gareth was awake before reveille. He suspected all of them were. There is a particular quality to the sleeplessness before a thing you cannot change, not the anxious, churning kind, but something quieter. Something that feels almost like readiness if you are not too careful about the distinction. He dressed in the dark. His uniform had been prepared the night before with a precision that bordered on ceremony, each crease a decision, each button a small deliberate act. The bearskin, the white gloves. He looked at his hands inside the gloves and thought, these are the hands that will do this today. Outside, London was already different. He could feel it before he saw it, a quality of stillness in the city that a city of 8 million people should not be capable of. A collective held breath that had started the moment the news broke 6 days ago and had been building since. The streets were lined. Not lined the way streets are lined for a parade, with a cheerful pressing forward of bodies and children on shoulders. Lined the way a cathedral aisle is lined, with a space down the middle that people understood without being told was not for them to fill. 3 deep in places. Some had been there since the previous night. The bearer party rode to St. Paul's in silence. Sergeant Williams, who had not asked if they were ready in December and did not ask now, sat at the front of the coach and looked out of the window, and that was all. There was nothing left to say. The saying part was finished. Everything that remained was doing. Gareth looked at the men beside him. Griffiths, who had gone down on the 3rd day of rehearsal and never gone down again. Morgan, who was 21 and from Cardiff, and had a way of going very still in the moments before hard things, like a gyroscope finding its axis. Davies, not the Davies with the pigeon grievance, a different Davies. There were always multiple Davises in a Welsh regiment. Who was the youngest of them at 18, and had not, to anyone's knowledge, shown a single outward sign of anything in the 6 weeks of preparation, which the others had decided to interpret as either extraordinary composure or a complete failure to grasp the situation. They did not speak. What could you say? They had done the work. The bruises were there, inside the white gloves, invisible to everyone but them. The steps were in their bodies now, counted into muscle memory through 47 practice runs until the sequence lived somewhere below thought, below choice, in the place where trained bodies go when conscious minds get loud and unhelpful. The coach stopped. St. Paul's Cathedral in January light is a particular kind of beautiful, cold, and enormous and absolutely certain of itself, in the way that only very old things built for very large purposes can be. It sits on Ludgate Hill, and it does not apologize for its size, its age, its opinion of its own importance. Christopher Wren built it after the Great Fire as a statement, and 300 years later it was still making the same statement with the same absolute conviction. Inside, the great and the powerful of the world had gathered. De Gaulle was there, 6'4", which in that company was not unusual, but in combination with his particular quality of presence, made him seem like a geographical feature rather than a person, something you navigated around rather than past. Representatives from 112 nations. The Queen, who had broken protocol to receive Churchill at the palace when he grew too frail to travel, who had done for him what she did for no other commoner, because some things are larger than protocol, and she understood this better than anyone. The bearer party did not see any of this. They were in an anteroom at the side of the nave, and they were counting their breathing, and Sergeant Williams was looking at them one last time with the expression of a man who has done everything that can be done, and is now required to trust it. "Shoulders," he said. One word, they understood it. Not a command, an acknowledgement. "I know what this costs, carry it anyway." They walked out. The weight was exactly as rehearsed. That was the first thing Gareth noticed, not with relief exactly, but with something adjacent to it. The 500 pounds settled onto 8 pairs of shoulders with the same patient, absolute authority it had settled onto them 47 times before, and the body, which had been trained, responded the way trained bodies respond. It absorbed, it distributed, it held. The nave of St. Paul's stretched before them, 175 feet of it, and the whole world was watching from every pew and balcony, and from 350 million television sets, and Gareth Rees from Merthyr Tydfil took the first step. Counted. This was the instruction he had given himself, and it was the right instruction. Not think, not feel, not understand what this means or who this was or what he did, just count. The steps were in his body. The counting kept his mind occupied with something precise and manageable while the rest of him did the work. 1, 2, 3. The organ was playing. He heard it the way you hear things when you are concentrating on something else, as texture rather than music, as atmosphere rather than sound. He was aware of the faces in the pews, thousands of them, in the way that you are aware of weather. He did not look at them. He looked at the back of Morgan's head, 3 inches in front of him, which was perfectly still. 17, 18, 19. His shoulder was speaking to him. Not yet screaming, that would come, but speaking, in the clear and reasonable voice of a load-bearing structure under stress, communicating information he acknowledged and set aside. The bruise from the rehearsals had mapped exactly to the pressure point. His body knew this pressure, had been introduced to it formally, repeatedly. It held. 30, 31, 32. This was the step where Griffiths had gone down on the third day. Griffiths did not go down. He felt it, a microscopic shift in the load distribution, a fraction of a second where something in Griffiths' left knee communicated doubt, and then Griffiths absorbed it, the way you absorb a stumble on a dark staircase, the way the body catches itself before the mind has finished registering the danger. The weight never moved. The step never faltered. Gareth counted. 51, 52, 53. The altar. They set the coffin down with the care of men who have practiced the act of setting something down almost as many times as they have practiced the act of lifting it. The final movement of something that must not be a relief, must not read as relief, even if every fiber of every shoulder is conducting a private, silent celebration. They stepped back. They turned. Their faces gave nothing. Sergeant Williams, watching from the side, permitted himself one single thing. He breathed. The service lasted 2 hours. The bearer party stood at their posts and did not move, which was, in its own way, a different kind of work, the work of stillness, which is not the absence of effort but effort of a specific and underestimated kind. Your body wants to shift, wants to adjust, wants to do the 1,000 small unconscious things that bodies do when they are standing still for long periods in the cold. You deny it, all of them, and you do this not because you are a machine but precisely because you are not, because you understand what you are standing beside and what it asks of you, and you give it freely. The hymns went up into the dome and came back down changed. There is an acoustic quality to St. Paul's Cathedral that does something to music, something to do with the height, the stone, the particular geometry of Wren's design, that makes it feel less like sound and more like weather, like something that is happening to you rather than something you are hearing. Gareth was aware of it the way he was aware of the organ, as atmosphere, as texture, as the backdrop against which the real work of the day was taking place. He thought about his grandfather, could not stop thinking about his grandfather, the man who had come back from Dunkirk and gone quiet about it, who had spoken about Churchill in that careful way of looking at the edges and not the center. He thought, you would have stood here, you would have stood exactly here. He thought, this is for you too. He did not let it reach his face. They lifted the coffin again at the end of the service. This was, in some ways, harder than the first time. Not physically, or not only physically, though the shoulders had been informing him throughout the 2 hours of standing that they had formed certain opinions about what had been done to them, and intended to share those opinions in full at the earliest opportunity. It was harder because now he knew the inside of it, had stood inside it, had breathed its specific air, had felt the weight of what the 2 hours meant, and carrying it out was a different act than carrying it in. Carrying it in was discipline. Carrying it out was something else, something that did not have a clean name. The doors of St. Paul's opened. The sound hit them like a physical thing. Not noise, the crowd was almost entirely silent. That was the thing. 300,000 people lining the Strand and not one of them making the sounds that 300,000 people normally make, the ambient human sound of breath and shuffle and whisper, the way crowds generate warmth and noise the way living things do. They were silent the way a cathedral is silent, a choosing silence, a deliberate silence, a silence that means something and knows it means something. Gareth stepped into it. The cold was sharp and clarifying. The sky was a flat, even January gray, the kind of sky that makes no promises. The gun carriage waited, and the horses were perfectly still, which horses are not by nature, which told you something about the quality of training that had brought this entire procession to this point. Everything trained to stillness, everything trained to hold. They transferred the coffin to the gun carriage. Then they walked behind it down the Strand, through that corridor of silence, and Gareth Rees from Merthyr Tydfil walked in step and did not look at the faces and counted, very quietly, inside his head, and was grateful for the counting. Tower Pier. The Thames in January is grey-brown and purposeful, a working river, a river that has been doing its job for 2,000 years and has no patience for sentiment, which is perhaps why what happened next landed so hard. The coffin was loaded onto Havengor, the Port of London Authority launch that would carry Churchill upriver to Festival Pier, and then to Waterloo Station, and then to his final rest in the Oxfordshire churchyard he had chosen years before. The bearer party took their position on the quayside. Their work, the specific and particular work they had been given and had trained for and had executed, was done. They stood and watched the launch pull away. And then on the south bank of the Thames, the dock cranes began to bow. One by one, not in any planned sequence, not in response to any order because no order had been given for this, the operators of the great industrial cranes along the wharves of Hayes Wharf lowered their booms. Slowly, deliberately, each one in turn, like a row of enormous slow-moving heads bowing to something passing on the water. These were dock workers, working men, the men Churchill had called on and who had answered every time he called, who had kept the supplies moving through the bombing when keeping the supplies moving was the difference between holding on and not holding on. They had not been asked to do this. Nobody had choreographed it. It had simply occurred to them independently, simultaneously, that this was the correct thing to do, and so they did it. Gareth watched the cranes bow. He had carried 500 pounds for 417 steps. By his count, he had counted everyone, and he had not faltered. None of them had faltered, and they had given everything that had been asked of them with the precision and the silence the occasion demanded. He had held himself together through the service and the procession and the transfer and the walk, had kept everything where it belonged, behind the face, behind the uniform, in the private interior space where soldiers keep things that cannot be shown. He watched the cranes bow, and something in him moved. He would not have been able to say, then or later, exactly what it was. Not grief, precisely. He had not known Churchill personally, had been 12 years old when the war ended. Carried its weight only second-hand through his grandfather's careful silences. Not pride exactly, though pride was there. Something larger than both. Something that had to do with continuity, with the sense of a thread running through time, through Dunkirk and the Blitz and the long dark years, and out the other side, through his grandfather's silence and his own standing up straight, and these dock workers lowering their cranes without being asked. All of it part of the same long human story of choosing to hold. Next to him, Morgan, 21, from Cardiff, the one who went still before hard things made a sound. Barely a sound. A single compressed exhale, the kind that is not quite a word and not quite a breath, the kind that means, yes, I know, I see it too. That was all. The coach back to Chelsea Barracks was quiet for a long time. Sergeant Williams sat at the front and looked out of the window, same as before. Nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes, and it was a different silence than the morning silence that had been the silence of preparation, of gathered intention. This was the silence of men who have done a thing and are now inside it, are now living in the aftermath of it, are now discovering the shape of it from the inside. Davies, the young one, the 18-year-old, the one whose apparent composure had remained mysterious throughout, was looking at his hands. He had taken off the white gloves. He was turning them over slowly, examining the palms, the way you examine something that has just done work you didn't know it could do. Griffiths was looking out of the window. His jaw was set in the particular way it had set on the fourth day of rehearsal, after the third day had sent him to the ground, and the fourth day was the day he decided what kind of man he was going to be about that. He looked like he was deciding something again, or had decided it. It was difficult to tell. Morgan, beside Gareth, was asleep. Gareth found this so comprehensively correct that he had to look away. Of course, Morgan was asleep. Morgan had gone still before the thing, had held himself absolutely for 4 hours and 417 steps, and now the thing was done and the body was claiming what the body was owed. There was no performance in it, no statement. It was simply the most honest thing in the coach. Gareth's shoulder was making its opinions known. The bruise had found its old address and was setting in again, deeper this time, with a thorough professionalism that suggested it intended to stay for some time. His feet had views as well. His lower back had entered the conversation with a specific and detailed grievance that he noted and filed, and did not intend to address until he was somewhere private. He looked at his hands inside the gloves. The same thought he had had in the dark that morning. These are the hands that did this today. Different thought now. He thought about Churchill in 1940, the specific 1940 of it, when the thing was genuinely not decided, when France had fallen and the beaches were coming in half the cabinet wanted to negotiate, when the rational assessment of the situation pointed in a direction that most people would have called reasonable. And Churchill had stood up and said, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the fields. We shall never surrender." Not because he had not understood the arithmetic, not because he didn't know the weight of what he was lifting, but because some things, once you've decided you're going to carry them, you carry. You count your steps and you hold your face and you do not put it down. Gareth thought, "I think I understand that now." He did not say it out loud. It was not the kind of thing you said out loud in a coach full of Welsh guardsmen heading back to Chelsea barracks through the grey London afternoon, their shoulders bruised, their work done. But he held it the way you hold things that are true. He did not tell the story much after. Not for years. There was a silence around it that he respected, not secrecy, not shame, something more like the silence his grandfather kept about Dunkirk. The understanding that some things are diminished by too much telling, that their weight is best preserved in the careful, private way, brought out rarely and held gently and put back. His mother noticed the bruise when he came home on leave. He told her it was training. She looked at him with the look that mothers use when they know they are not being told everything, and have decided to accept that, and she made him tea and did not press, and this was, in its way, exactly right. Griffiths married a woman from Pontypool and became a school teacher and coached rugby on weekends. Gareth went to his retirement party 40 years later, and they stood in a corner of a function room in Cardiff drinking mediocre wine and not talking about it. The way you don't talk about things that have become too large and too solid to be moved by talking. Morgan, who had slept on the coach home and never made a production of any of it, sent Gareth a card on January 30th every year for 30 years. No message in it, just his name. Morgan. Gareth sent one back. Davies, the youngest one, the one who had turned his gloves over in his hands on the way home, became a funeral director. Gareth thought about that sometimes. There was something in it. Something about understanding what it means to carry something carefully, to give the weight its proper respect, to treat the last journey of a person as a thing that should be done exactly right. He thought Davies had understood something in those 47 rehearsals that turned out to be useful for a life. Sergeant Williams retired in 1974. At his leaving due, also in Cardiff, because that was where they all ended up eventually. The way Welsh people do, he stood up and said almost nothing about his career and rather a lot about his wife and children. And then he said at the end, almost as an afterthought, "The bearer party was the best thing I was ever part of. Not because of what we did, because of who did it." He sat down and picked up his pint. Nobody clapped. They all understood that clapping would have been wrong. Some things you receive in silence because that is the correct response, because silence is not emptiness. It is fullness of a different kind. Gareth Rees died in 2019, in Merthyr Tydfil, in the house where he had grown up, with his daughter beside him. On his desk when she cleared it, She found three things. A photograph from January 30th, 1965. Not of himself. He was invisible in it. One of 8 men in bearskins with identical faces of stone. But of the cranes on the south bank of the Thames, 5 of them caught in the act of bowing, their great metal necks inclined toward the water, toward the small launch moving upriver. A card, just a name, Morgan. And a single sentence written in his own hand on a piece of notepaper, undated. No address. He told us the truth, and we were grateful for it. His grandfather's words. Carried as things worth carrying are carried, carefully, without faltering, all the way to the end.